I'm a migrant. I've lived in 6 different countries for more than a year, but I've never lived in the same country for more than 15 years. I've also changed countries 11 times. I'll let you figure out how that adds up. My migration actually started before I was even born, because it started in 1956 when the Hungarian people rose up against an oppressive regime. It started with the students, but then quickly spread to the workers, the police, and finally also to the army. Curiously enough, they didn't oppose communism. They just opposed the students in particular. They just opposed the oppressive and abusive interpretation that the Stalinist regime had. Anyway, the rebellion was successful, and they toppled the old regime, and a new government was declared. However, this new government knew that they couldn't stand up against the Soviets, so they were counting on help from NATO. Unfortunately, in spite of countless radio broadcasts that had preceded the revolution, from Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty about promising NATO help, NATO did not mobilize. Once the Soviets had concluded that the Hungarians were alone, they sent in the tanks. It was an uneven fight. The tanks, even though it was fierce fighting and 2,500 Hungarians lost their lives, but the Soviet tanks in the end crushed the rebellion. They quickly rounded up the members of the new government, Imre Nagy and his ministers, and executed them summarily. My parents and the other 200,000 people who had taken part in the revolution, they did not wait around to be rounded up by the Soviets. They headed for the Austrian border on foot. And my parents, who had just been married, and they were to be my parents, actually, they were among these people. They crossed the border, which was open for a week or so, and then they arrived in Austria, where the 200,000 people ended up dispersing all over the world. 30,000 went to America, a couple of thousand went to Sweden, including my parents. They settled in Sweden, but they were homesick. They missed the Hungarian food, they missed the friends and relatives that they had to leave behind. So in 1960, when the new regime had declared amnesty to all the people who had taken part in the revolution, they decided to return to Hungary. So they took a train, and the train was loaded onto a boat, and they docked at a harbor in Sassnitz, East Germany. Now, as soon as they had arrived, and they were greeted by soldiers with machine guns, dogs, etc., that were going through the train, really ransacking everybody and checking for IDs, etc., they had changed their mind. But there was no return. Because they had crossed this border, the Iron Curtain, which was in full construction at this time, and there was no turning back. So they had to come up with a different plan. For all of you who haven't seen the Iron Curtain, it stretched from north in Finland all the way to the Black Sea, and it was basically a maximum security prison with a life prison sentence for all the 300 million people living behind it. Nobody could leave. This border was mined, and the guards that were sitting in those guard towers, they had ordered to shoot to kill for anybody trying to leave. So my parents quickly realized that they could not cross this border, but they wanted to leave. So they came up with a different plan. They tried to convince the Hungarian authorities that they loved Hungary, but they also liked to travel. So as soon as it was possible, they applied for tourist visas. The first attempt in 1965, it kind of failed because the 2 children were not granted visas. The second attempt in 1968 to visit Norway and Finland also failed because I was held back as a hostage. However, when they returned, the authorities were quite surprised because they'd expected them to, in fact, defect, and they used the Red Cross to get me out. But when they didn't and returned, all of a sudden they were trusted. So next year, when we departed on a family vacation for 2 weeks with 9 suitcases, nobody paid attention. It was a little excessive amount of luggage. And nobody also paid attention to the fact that we had sold our car, and we took the first vacation ever as a family, because my father loved driving, on a train. Anyway, so we took the train to Rijeka on on the current Croatian shore. There we checked in the 9 suitcases into a railway locker and set off towards the Italian border, using public transportation first and then shifting to walking. Now, my parents knew that this border was not guarded like the rest of the Iron Curtain. What they didn't know was what was the actual situation. Were there any guards at all? Was there a fence, etc.? So, and we also didn't know how the Yugoslav border guards would react if they would catch us. So they had this cover story invented that, of course, us children, we didn't know what we were doing. So they told us the cover story, and this was also the story to the, that they were going to tell to the border guards, is that we were on a day hike looking for some old ruins that were supposed to be near to this border. Anyway, because we were on a day hike, the only thing we brought along with us was a briefcase with a nice big Hungarian salami and 2 bottles of water. As we started to walk towards the border from the last village, we hit a little bit of a scare because we heard gunshots and we got off the road and we hid in the trees. But in the end, it turned out to be hunters. But it had gotten dark, so we spent the night in the forest and continued to hike next morning. And we crossed a completely unguarded border at 9 o'clock in the morning. Once we had reached Italy, we walked down to the first road and we hitchhiked into Trieste and went to the Carabinieri and asked for asylum. And after a couple of hours of them taking our information, they transferred us to this collection camp. And this is a photo from that time that was outside of Trieste. And the circled area indicates this temporary holding tank that they put us in for a week, where they separated women and children from the men. And I never understood why, but we were there for a week. Anyway, the rest of the time we spent in the middle building in a pretty nice, decent apartments. And what I remember from being in this camp today is two things. One is I watched the first moon landing in that big building on the left, on a grainy screen, together with the hundreds of other people. And the other thing I remember is seeing people getting out of these police buses, arriving with new refugees, getting out in their bathing suits. There were people who actually crossed the border by swimming the 2-kilometer bay between Yugoslavia and Italy. That was kind of an eye-opener. Imagine arriving in a new country without anything. You don't have cell phones, you don't have money, you don't have anything. You just have your bathing suit. And you walk into a police station to ask for asylum. These people had some courage. Anyway, after they had determined where we wanted to go, we wanted to return to Sweden, they transferred us to another camp in Kapula, which was a little bit less civilized. These were basically old military barracks that had been converted to refugee camps. And we were in the 4th building from the right, about halfway down, and in a room of 16 square meters, family of 4. Now you think that's tight. Across the street, we had another family, an Albanian family with 12 children. And I always wondered how they managed in 20 square meters of space. But anyway, what I learned in this camp was that rats are actually very useful creatures because they did all the garbage collection in the camp. And I also remember meeting an actual Hungarian family with 2 teenage children and a dog, a Vizsla, John, who had also swam the bay. They had brought along one of these inflatable little dinghies where their intent was that the dog would rest in it. It turned out during the swim that everybody rested in it except the dog. Anyway, after about 7 months of largely inactivity and boredom, we received notice that we got asylum, permanent asylum in Sweden, and we boarded a plane for Sweden. In Sweden, we got a crash course for a couple of weeks in Swedish, and then I started school in 3rd grade after the Easter break. I have to say I grew up as a normal child in Sweden and did all the things that other Swedish teens do, etc. And then I graduated from high school, and upon graduation, I applied for a scholarship to go to America to study for 1 year. My intent was to improve my English because at that point, even though I had studied English for 9 years, 4 hours a week, my English was not fluent. And I wanted to improve it. And I think instinctively I was preparing myself for future migration. After I returned, I enrolled in engineering school, got a degree in computer systems, and then the search for job opportunities ended up taking me back to the United States for a second time, because I wanted to work on software development, and that only happened in the United States at that time. After, this was in 1985. In 1999, while I continued to work in the high-tech sector, the fate kind of brought us back to Europe, because I was working on a project where we did development in Bangalore, and flying from Seattle to Bangalore, 12-hour time difference, 25-hour flight, was just too difficult. So we had to find a place to live in Europe. We could have gone to Sweden, we could have gone to Hungary, but I chose to come to Italy because I thought it would be exciting for the entire family to learn another culture, learn another language. And so I've migrated a bit, you could say. But this is not actually that unusual. It has just been unusual for us in the last 100 years or so. Because actually, if you look at human history, we have always migrated a lot. If you look at maps about human development, so to say, for the last 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years or even longer, it's just full of arrows and numbers of people moving this way or that way. We have migrated to search for game, we have migrated to search for agricultural land, and these days we migrate for job opportunities. In fact, the Europeans migrated so much between 1500 and 1900 that we kind of went all over the globe, either to settle or to colonize and steal stuff from these various places. The only places in the world that curiously avoided domination by Europeans are Japan, that itself became a colonial power, and then Iran and Thailand escaped European domination because the two major powers couldn't agree on who was going to dominate it. Anyway, at some point, however, we kind of stopped migration. And why did we do that? Well, we did it because of war. What happened was that from 1850 on, the German population was growing very rapidly, and as they were trying to solve their population pressures with migration, they ran into resistance. Because as we saw on a previous map, most of the world was already taken by some other major powers, and they didn't want more Germans. If Germans could have freely emigrated to America, for instance, America could have become German-speaking. There were so many German immigrants going there during that period. So anyway, at some point, the Germans tried to solve their internal population pressures by going to war, and by doing it, instigating a major European war on scale. So they didn't succeed in World War I, so they tried again in 1939. Hitler was a maniac, but he was not stupid. His aim with the war was to create what he called Lebensraum, which is room to live, for the German people by taking territories from the Poles, the Czechs, and Ukrainians. In fact, during this period, when the war started, there were already 14 million Germans living in those countries. So anyway, after the war, migration kind of came to a halt, as all the European countries kind of closed their borders and focused on recovery, etc. And it's interesting to note that in 1969, when we were refugees in the camps in Italy, there was only one country in Europe who accepted even one refugee from those camps. And we're not talking about there were millions, we're talking about hundreds. There was only one country, and that was Sweden. All the other countries had closed borders. However, this started opening up again in the 70s, first with a flow from south to north, from rural agriculture to industrial. And then lately, what we've seen the last 20 years is a flow from east to west. We have over 10 million, or I think maybe 15 million people have moved from the Eastern European countries to opportunities in the West. So, I think, especially given the audience here, you will likely migrate. If you're not already a migrant, the chances are you're going to become one. Now, in that situation, you can take two attitudes. You can either stick your head in the sand and try to hide from it, or you can, so to say, embrace it and look at the world as your oyster. And in that case, what you need to do is prepare. You need to work on two things, in my opinion. You need to, on the educational front, you need to get a degree that is easily transferable. Some degrees, unfortunately, are still very much locked to various nations. Second, you need to work on your language skills. If you're not native English speaker, learn proper English. That's your ticket to migration today. If you're a native English speaker, well, you have it kind of good, you can migrate. But unless you develop the capacity to learn another foreign language, and you have to start developing that capacity at a young age, because the adults I've met, Americans and British, etc., who did not learn a foreign language when they were young, they struggle greatly to acquire them when they are in their 30s and 40s. If you migrate, embrace it. Make the best of it. Especially focus on the first year, because it might actually be your last, you never know. And immediately start learning the local language, if you don't speak it already. And start learning it before you arrive even. I'm astounded how many families relocate to Florence. They don't speak Italian, but they knew 6 months before that they were going to come here, and they didn't bother to put the kids in an Italian language classes or take language classes themselves. It's kind of crazy. Now, as you migrate, you're going to hit some problems, so you need to persevere. The problems you will hit, you might not know about in advance. I remember my biggest problem in integrating and adjusting to life in Sweden was the obligatory school lunches that I had to eat for the first 3 years. It traumatized me. Because, school lunches in general, and especially state-funded schools, are not the greatest. But here there was a combination. Also, it was Swedish school lunches, and Swedish cuisine is kind of different from Hungarian. So anyway, that was kind of tough for me. For instance, but you hit other problems. Europeans who migrated to America discovered that the biggest problem is that they can't rent anything because they have no credit rating. So all kinds of strange problems will come up when you do it. However, I think if you do it right, if you throw yourself at it, you can enjoy it greatly. Frankly, because all the countries in the world have something really special and beautiful that is unique to them. And if you go in there with the right attitude, there's a cultural bonanza that is waiting for you. Now, people look at my life and they say, oh, what a complicated, strange life. And I say, well, yeah, but I look at it like I've lived a richer life than most people in the world because I've had the benefit of enjoying and learning the best things from 6 different cultures. And the biggest problem I have actually today is that this question, where are you from? So I've developed this standard answer. It's like, oh, how much time do we have? Because it can be a short answer. It depends on the person I'm looking at. I'll decide, okay, we can have a conversation, or I'll say, no, I'm Hungarian. Anyway, lastly, I have a message to all the people who live in Florence. Be nice to the migrants that you encounter on the streets here. Frankly, because they're doing nothing else than what you or your children will do. They're seeking opportunities in a place that is not the country of their birth. They may be selling, the people you see, they might be selling socks or cigarette lighters. But you know what? In 40 years, the children might be the ones saving your life when you have a heart attack. Thank you.